Alrighty, it's still morning. Good morning, everyone. And welcome to the breakout session today. My name's Charishma Kaliyanda, as you probably would have seen from the outline, and I'm from Professionals Australia. So we're the leading professional association for STEM professionals in Australia, and we basically exist to improve the standards and conditions for the industries and organisations that you'll go into as graduates. We're not for profit, and we work to fix your industry in a number of different ways. So firstly, we have a survey that we send out to our members about their pay and conditions to sort of see where the standard is at. So someone previously asked, if you're ever asked in a job interview, what do you feel your graduate rate should be, or what do you feel that your value is? This is a concrete way that you can get some of that information that's sort of benchmarked to people with similar levels of experience or skills. We also produce a work readiness report where we go out and survey the organisations and the people that actually employ our members, and figure out and ask them what it is that they're looking for in their graduates or in the people that they're hiring, and how does that then translate into the information that we give to our members about what they should be doing, not just at university but also in the first few years of their career. And we also sort of produce informers like the one that you see on the screen, so that you actually know what's happening on the ground in the various industries that you might go out into, and you can then use that information when it comes to approaching organisations for internships or graduate roles, and building your networks and contacts, because a lot of people value when you've done your research and you are prepared, like a few speakers have said this morning. So this is one way again that you can prepare yourself and do some of that background research. So, speaking of backgrounds, I'll give you some background into myself. I started a Bachelor of Advanced Science here at the University of New South Wales a while ago. I left with a pretty unorthodox mix of skills and experiences. Although I loved science, I also found myself getting involved in lots and lots of clubs and societies. I served a term as the President of the Student Representative Council. I got involved in the Advanced Science Student Society, which was unfortunately named ASSOC, and as well as PsychSoc and a bunch of other organisations. But those sorts of extracurricular activities were really sort of what made me aware as to what I was interested in, what my skill sets were, what my strengths were. And so by the time I left with a combined science and arts degree, I knew that I wanted to sort of address the problem of helping people develop their skills. So I went into a Masters of Occupational Therapy at the University of Sydney, and I've since worked in the private sector, in not-for-profit sector as I am at the moment, as well as the public sector. In another role, I'm an elected councillor in a local government association, or in a local council in southwest Sydney. So I'm really passionate about making sure that we have science involved in public policy decisions, both at the local government level as well as others. So that's part of my kind of interest at the moment. And in terms of my official title at Professionals Australia, I'm the National Coordinator of Young Professional Services. So it's a fancy title that basically means I'm responsible for developing and delivering all the different ways that we help our younger members like yourselves get from where you are at university and into the workforce successfully. So that's kind of a brief little entree into myself. I know that this breakout session is called Public versus Private, and we've had quite a sense of where everything fits in the previous panel session, but it's a little bit disingenuous because all of you throughout your career will be exposed to both, as well as the not-for-profits, as well as other parts of the industry and the broader labour market. So it's important to understand that there's a difference in approach. That's probably where the biggest difference lies between public and private sector, and you need to know what that difference is. You need to know how that applies to you, so you can use that information as you plan your career, as you figure out where you'd like to start, not necessarily where you'd like to stay for 30 years or 40 years, however long your career is. So today I'll be going over what the graduate labour market looks like for scientists. So some of what I'll mention just reinforces what some of the speakers have mentioned this morning, so that you really get an idea of the picture of what you're walking out into. I'll also be touching on some of the differences in working in the public and private sector and how to make the most appropriate decisions for your career and what your next steps should be. So all fields have a supply, sort of pressures that come from the supply of people, or how many people with similar levels of skills or similar qualifications come from the same background. They also have pressures that come from the demand of people. So what is the availability of people with your skill sets for their particular needs? Of all of the STEM fields, science enrolls the most number of students, and thanks to a growing focus on the importance of STEM skills going forward, since 2009 that's only sort of increased. So the whole discussion for the last sort of 6-7 years has been the importance of producing STEM graduates, producing people with STEM skills, and obviously that's flowed into high school leavers who have chosen to do a lot of science, so like yourselves, who've chosen to do a science degree. So that's where you see a huge increase in the supply of people going through a science degree. And you'll notice that since 2009, there were 4,000 more people completing a science degree each year. This is especially true in life sciences, which is now known as biological sciences. So about 45% of enrolments and completions are actually in the life sciences or biological sciences. So that's, again, the supply side of the picture. In terms of the demand side, the availability of specific roles that call for scientific qualifications, or kind of have very clearly, you can apply for this if you have a science degree, whatever your major, has seen a little bit of a lull because of the post-mining boom age. So that's most significantly hit people with geology majors, and there's been a shift in terms of the industries or the areas that people with environmental science qualifications or experience go into. So that's a little bit of the demand side of the pressure. That leads you to the table that you see up the top, where, as a few people have mentioned, that graduate employment rate, or the short-term graduate employment rate, is not the best picture, right? That said, that leads you to these pictures here. So in the last 10 years, you can see that there's been a shift in where the roles are, or what sort of industries people with science backgrounds are going into. So obviously a huge number of graduates are going into medical research, as well as environmental science. But there's also been a corresponding drop in the number of advertised positions. That's not to say that there's been a drop in the number of positions overall. It's just that you have to take a different approach when it comes to where you find these roles, how you look at them, and how you cull through what's appropriate for you and what's not. So as I mentioned, these are the pictures for short-term science graduates. So as Mia mentioned, this is sort of the picture 4 months after completing a degree. That said, at this point, approximately sort of half of the graduates had found full-time work, and just over half of them said that their qualification was a formal requirement or was important for the job that they were currently in. And another 20% said that the degree was relevant or in some way useful for the job that they were doing. So the longer term, so I mentioned that this is sort of that short-term picture. More science students continue with postgraduate qualifications than any other STEM field. So the vast majority of STEM graduates actually science graduates actually go, okay, well, how can I then turn this into a subsequent step? So the longer term picture for science graduates is actually much better. So you go from this to, at 30 years or older, the unemployment rate for science graduates is 3% or less, which is a much better picture, yeah? Much less depressing, much more exciting. So at that particular point, when you look at that longer term picture, 44% of people with science degrees or science graduates who answered the survey said that they worked generally in these areas or these fields. So 44% went into these sort of what you may regard as traditional science areas or science fields. What about the other 55 odd percent? That's the beautiful thing about a science degree, because it doesn't necessarily come with a career roadmap. A science degree, sort of the unifying thing for a science graduate is that it's the ability to think like a scientist or use the scientific principles to bring about a transferable skill set that you can use in many different jobs, many different areas. It's what we've spent the morning discussing. So the gap, though, is that science students like yourself often don't really identify the value of that transferable skill set, the value of that mindset that you bring, until very late in their degree or even after graduation, which can make finding your feet a little bit harder, which is why you've got that short-term picture, which is quite poor, but a much better longer-term picture. So that brings me to what Alan Finkel, who's Australia's chief scientist, has said about this kind of idea of the purpose of a university degree being to make you job ready, or have that short-term picture in terms of employment good to go. So according to Alan Finkel, it's not necessarily the short-term or the job-ready picture that you need to focus on, but it's about being job capable. So it's about that longer term picture, identifying how and where you can use your skills in different areas. So as I mentioned, science graduates actually fare really well when it comes to job competence, because after a couple of years of going, okay, what can I do with my skills? You tend to land on your feet and you tend to kind of use your skills in different industries and different occupations and that kind of thing. So what I'm saying is that university teaches you the skills to be job capable, so the skills that are regarded favourably by employers in both the public and the private sector. So these are skills like collaboration and teamwork, oral and written communication skills, ethical reasoning, which can be incredibly important, and the quantitative skills that allow you to apply mathematical and statistical thinking. But you need to seek out the experiences that make you job ready as you're looking to hit the ground out of work, and that's what you can do whilst you're still at university. So seek out the experiences that actually make you job ready and shorten that time that you struggle to find your feet or find your place following your degree. But how do you make the decisions that allow you to do that? How do you figure out where and how to use skills and knowledge? Earlier today, Violet talked about the changing nature of careers, not just in science and STEM fields, but across all disciplines and all fields. And what a career will look like in our lifetime is very different to what a career looked like in our parents' lifetimes, and even before that. So taking that on board, what is working in the public sector like versus what is working in the private sector like? What does a career in each of these actually mean? So let's start by fleshing out some commonly held assumptions. So what's the stereotype? When you think about working in the public sector, what's the stereotype? I'm going to ask for some engagement.
Heavily bogged down in bureaucracy.
Yep, so very bureaucratic and slow to move. Others? Yeah.
Just government in general, being behind the desk, sort of thing.
Yeah, so not very hands-on in terms of the science that you're doing. Yeah.
No funding.
Yep, so very limited in terms of what you can achieve. Yep.
More limited in terms of your career progression, like there's more a linear path to follow rather than having new opportunities based on how good you are.
Yep, okay, so less merit-based and more process-based. Yep, okay.
Quite structured, but also maybe secure. I think a lot of people think of public sector as being a secure industry.
Yes, okay. So if you prioritise job security over sort of some of the other things, the stereotype is that you'd tend to go to the public sector.
More commercialised.
Sorry?
More commercialised.
More commercialised, yep, in the public sector. Oh, in the private, so less commercialised than the private sector, yep. What are some commonly held assumptions or stereotypes about the private sector? Yeah.
Profit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe seen as more successful as well.
Yep, so
Yeah.
it facilitates success. Yep.
Harder and less perks.
Okay, so, yeah. So going back to this idea of sort of job security and conditions and things.
That sort of stuff that you can get in the public sector that you don't have in private.
Yeah.
More creative freedom. You get to be more independent to actually do what you want. It's following someone else's framework.
Yep. Okay. So that you've all fleshed out the common sort of stereotypes or the assumptions that people have about working in the public versus the private sector, and there is this really common sort of idea of government as sort of slow to move, not very creative, and you're basically kind of pushing paper rather than actually doing science. Whereas the flip side is the stereotype for the private sector, obviously. But who knew that the public sector is actually the biggest employer in Australia? Yep. So being the biggest employer in Australia means that although the idea is that it's this monolith, this sort of, this one blah grey mess of a level, the public sector is actually made up of a whole range of different separate organisations. So you have different levels of the public sector. So you've got local government, state government, federal government, obviously. You've also got statutory bodies. You've got corporations like Sydney Water, and you've also got smaller teams within that. So to generalise all of that whole diversity of different opportunities as just this one thing would be doing it a bit of a disservice. Flip to the private sector, it's equally diverse. So it may not be, it is not the biggest employer in Australia, the private sector, but it is equally diverse in terms of the types of organisations you can go into, the size of them, their what they exist for, all of those sorts of things. So the diversity in terms of what you can do, the career paths you can have, hold true for both. But the biggest difference would be in the purpose of them. So someone mentioned before that the private sector exists, it's for profit, right? How does that differ to the public sector?
It's more for public benefit.
Yep.
And society, I suppose. But a lot of private sector are kind of doing more of that giving back to society type stuff.
Yeah, so the corporate social responsibility, the sort of,
that's the buzzword.
the whole sort of, we need to appear good because people are making ethical choices about what they consume and who they pay their money to. So it is part of the profit making process.
One good thing about the public sector is they do have, I suppose, the power to have more of a long-term plan.
Mm-hmm.
Like public sector can sort of look, 40 years into the future, whereas private sector is sort of more, the next quarterly report, the annual report, that sort of stuff.
Yep. So there's kind of a difference in terms of the who you serve in working between the public and the private sector. So if you are working in the public sector, ultimately you're kind of your master, apart from your chain of command. Ultimately your master is the taxpayer or the community, right? With the private sector, ultimately your master is either the shareholders or the owner of the organisation or the board or whoever has equity in the organisation. So you're serving different masters when it comes to the different sectors, and that sort of flows down into the decisions that are made, into the priorities that each organisation might have, and also the kind of the length of the strategy or the length of the planning that you have access to, right? So the other thing that sort of that shifts between public and private sector is the role of each is different depending on the industry that you go into or the field that you're interested in. So I'm just going to start picking on people to kind of give me a sense of what field or what kind of organisation or what kind of industry you're interested in going into. So.
Well, my major's in physics.
Yep.
I'm not sure where I'd take it from there. I do like the idea of working in like a national lab sort of environment, but I'm not tied down.
Sure.
In that sort of path.
Okay, so you're thinking a bit more lab-based. I'll reframe it according to sort of the question of the day. What problem do you want to solve?
There's too many. I would like to solve something that would benefit society broadly. That's sort of my motivation for coming here.
Yep.
I haven't been able to drill much deeper than that.
Okay.
Physics opens up so many different areas, you know, that each course gives you, opens your mind further and further.
Absolutely.
It's just so wide.
Yep, absolutely. So just to draw on maybe say one aspect of where you can use physics in a different way and how the specific nature of the industry shapes the opportunities that you have access to. Let's say weather. So the application of physics to telling the weather and that sort of thing. When I say weather, most people think of one of the bigger public sector organisations, which is the Bureau of Meteorology, right? So they do a lot of the specific data collection, the reporting, and they do a lot of the coalface work when it comes to picking up weather patterns and kind of making sure that we know whether to take an umbrella or, you know, wear flip-flops or whatever. But when it comes to actually communicating that information, that's quite a lot is the domain of the private sector. So everything from, say, the apps that you use, right, may be sort of third-party apps that are developed by the private sector and then sold, but the data that they use at its heart comes from the Bureau of Meteorology, right? So we have, I can't remember the exact number of members, but a lot of our members work in, say, in the Bureau doing a lot of that data collection and the forecasting stuff. And so there's that kind of balance of how your opportunities may depend on what sort of industry you're going into or what sort of specific field. That's just one example. So, and sort of taking that back into what the career path looks like, or, you know, how do you get from where you are now to down the track thinking about the application of the problems that you solve, it's really important to understand how the recruitment process works in both the public sector and the private sector, right? So on the face of it, this is what a public sector recruitment process usually looks like. So this comes from the Public Sector Commission of the New South Wales Government. The Public Sector Commission sets out the competencies, it sets out the processes for a lot of different government departments on the New South Wales state level. So as you can see, you've got the sort of the initial stages where they try and do that culling process. So they take it down from approximately 415 applications in that first few steps down to less than 50. Right, so that's through a sort of range of tests, as well as the assessment centres, which kind of involve sort of skill-based assessments of your competencies, right? And then right through to sort of meeting you face-to-face, checking out whether how you've presented in the initial test bears out to how you come across in person, right? That's the kind of the formal process, as it were. Because of that difference in purpose, so we talked about the public sector's commitment being to community wellbeing, and having that comes with it a level of accountability, right? So by law, every single opportunity that exists in the public sector has to be advertised. Whatever level of government, whatever statutory body, whatever regulatory body, if you're interested in going down that path, has to be advertised, and there has to be a transparent process. Right. Contrast that to private sector recruitment. Can everyone see that? Slightly better? Yeah. So when you contrast that to what recruitment looks like in the private sector in terms of how you come across opportunities, how you then go through the process and that sort of thing, there is a little bit more diversity in terms of the private sector. So for example, just under half of all opportunities are advertised online. Others may be advertised through people's word of mouth networks and that sort of thing. But as I said, this is not to discount the fact that word of mouth and networks and who you know does not matter just as much in the public sector as it matters in the private sector, because the upshot of that recruitment process that I showed you is that it costs a lot of money to recruit in the public sector, right? So if you're going to go through that recruitment process and spend whatever $30,000 trying to recruit a cohort of graduates or even sort of level ones, the last thing you want to do is to recruit people who turn out to be psychos who you don't want to sit next to on an airplane. Yeah? And so word of mouth and kind of being able to kind of get the feel of someone or get a recommendation from someone matters just as much in the public sector as it does in the private sector. So that's one of the commonly held assumptions or common myths that people kind of subscribe to when it comes to the difference between public and private sector, that just because there's an obligation to advertise, that there's an obligation to be transparent about recruitment and those decisions, that networking and knowing people and building those contacts doesn't matter just as much in the public sector as it does in the private sector. Because ultimately, you're working with people, they want to know that they're making the right decision by employing you, and they want to know that you're going to be a good fit for their team. Because the consequence of not making that decision correctly is that it leads to years of poor performance or, you know, just a dysfunctional team, and that's not something that they want, regardless of what sector they come from. So that's one of the biggest myths in terms of the difference between public and private sector. What's another myth that you might have in terms of the recruitment process? Or who's sort of looking at specifically going into the public or the private sector? Who's sort of got an idea of that right now? Someone went to put up their hand? Yes?
Sort of more public, and I suppose the assumption is that it seems like, with the exception of some of the big four kind of stuff,
Yep.
it seems like the public sector recruiting process is, you know, you go into the online system and you do your application, it goes to like everyone and you're just a number in the system
Yep.
until you eventually get to an interview if you're lucky.
Yep.
Kind of thing, yeah.
Yep.
Whereas
So-
I think some of the private sector businesses, it is more about like your connections, and there seems to be, in my experience, I haven't felt like as much of a number with private applications
Yep.
to smaller businesses. Yeah.
It goes back to kind of that, the diversity or the type of organisation or the team that you're recruiting into. So if you're in a large organisation with, you know, for example, 415 applicants that then, you know, they need to cull into 50 applicants, there is that sense of being a number. And as Peter, is it Pete or Dave?
Dave.
Sorry, as Dave said earlier today, trying to exclude people rather than include them. There's definitely that sense, but particularly as you may go further in your career, or you might go into a more specialised area as well, people really want to know that your skill set matches what they need for their team, and you know, that sense of being a number, because they really need what you can do, reduces as well. On the flip side, just as there are a large number of applications for public sector roles, there can be just as many for private sector roles. So about a year ago, I was on an employment panel with the head of HR from Arup, which is a large sort of consultancy in the construction and environmental services space. And they're quite well known for being sort of really innovative in what they do. And she was telling me that for their graduate program, they got over 4,000 applications, and they could only take on sort of 15 graduates. So again, that trying to have a large group of people down to a small one exists in both spheres. Yeah. So in terms of in terms of that question of how do you be both? How do you be both job ready and job competent, so that you address that first few years of struggling to find how to sell your skills and how to fit what you can do into what an employer is looking for? It's really important to think sort of a little bit more outside the box than I think a lot of science graduates are used to thinking about, particularly because, as you can see, not all law graduates go into to be lawyers. Not all science graduates end up specifically doing science, so to speak. So before we were asked to think about what is the problem that we wanted to solve as scientists, reflecting on my own career and the things that I've kind of found myself doing up until now, the common theme or the common sort of problem that I've wanted to address is helping people develop the skills that they need to address the challenges that they face. I really like working with people on an individual level. Most of my job involves sort of career coaching, mock interviews, things like that. I also have a background in mental health as an occupational therapist. I also worked in sort of stroke rehab and things like that. So that the common theme there is sort of skill development, helping people get back into what they want to do or meet their goals and develop the skills in order to do that. So it's important to think about when you do get an opportunity that is perhaps outside your comfort zone or is outside what you saw as your future or what you saw as what you were going to go into, think about it in terms of that mindset rather than, is this what my degree, is this what I can do with my degree, or am I comfortable with this particular major or whatnot going into this pathway. Do you have a question? Sorry, I thought you raised your hand. And also, because of the value of those transferable skills that you've developed, so I mentioned things like teamwork, collaboration, your communication skills, and ethical reasoning and your quant skills. Those are really core skills that you can apply in a lot of different situations, and it goes back to teaching people what they need to know. So once you've got that language of those core skills, where you can use those core skills just depends on developing that extra knowledge to kind of fit that gap. And so more and more organisations are recognising the value of those core skills, and so again, the opportunity for where you can use those skills has broadened significantly. And there's also sort of not that kind of idea of limiting yourself to a technical role or whatnot. So again, think about what it is that you prefer to do and what the public and private sector look like in that particular organisation. So we talked about meteorology and the weather. So if you were really interested in getting into that field and you really wanted to do the hands-on work, you'd go into the public sector in that example. If you were looking at then communicating that raw data in different ways and developing apps and things like that, then you'd probably go into the private sector in that particular field. So it's about thinking, okay, well, what does the public sector do in that particular field? What does the private sector do? And what do I want to do within that space? So that's sort of really important to work out those three things. And what you can do right here, right now, whilst you're at university, is these super key things. So someone said before that one of the best pieces of advice that they got was to do internships and learn on the job and that sort of thing. It doesn't matter how long it is, even if you can only get your foot in the door for a day, it's super helpful in just sort of helping you build some of those networks as well. So about a year and a half ago, a member came to me and said, look, I'm only in second year, but I really want to do work experience or an internship at this particular firm. And they've got sort of, they advertise it as a penultimate year sort of thing. It was that they were doing a 4-year degree. So I said, look, apply anyway. And if you get rejected, go back to the HR person and say, look, really want to work for you guys. I didn't get through the program, but I'd love to just spend a day shadowing, someone who does this and just get a sense of what it's like to work for you guys. That then led to an internship with that organisation the subsequent year, because they'd spent that day building connections and sort of maintaining that contact over the next few months, so that when it came time to apply for the internship for the subsequent year, they were pretty much a shoo-in. So sort of taking a step back in order to take two steps forward can be super, super useful in both ticking off networks in both ticking off networks as well as getting some of that workplace experience and just getting a sense of what a culture is like. Because the biggest sort of impact on whether you're enjoying your work or you're fulfilled in your work isn't so much what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, but it's who you're doing it with. So when you get a sense of what a workplace is like to work at, and every workplace is unique in its own different way, and you will interact with that environment differently, getting a sense of what that's like, whether that's that sort of is conducive to the way that you work and how you like to interact with people, that's the first step to kind of really enjoying what you do down the track. So even if the day-to-day stuff is great, you're really enjoying it, but if all of the interpersonal stuff isn't so great, you're developing some skills so that you can then take that into an environment that you are enjoying what you do and you are sort of enjoying that interpersonal relationships, regardless of whether it's public or private sector. So just to kind of break down a couple of different industries and how it sort of works, a few people that you heard from earlier today are involved in the biotech and the pharma space. Australia punches above its weight when it comes to medical research and pharmaceutical research. We're actually quite high on the list of countries in terms of our biotech output. I think for relative to our population, we are 8th in the world in terms of our biotech output, which is quite high. And so a lot of that space is, even if it's in the private sector, a lot of the funding is driven by government grants and government priorities. So if you're looking at sort of getting into that space, follow the funding in terms of what is being funded at the moment, what are national priorities, what are both government and the private sector saying in that particular space, because that's when you get a better sense of stability, regardless of whether you're in the public or private sector. So someone mentioned before that one of the counterpoints to stability or security in the public sector was limits of 3-year funding cycles, which is what grant applications are usually, or grants or projects are usually sort of limited to. If you pick a space that's got a lot of traffic, that's got a lot of potential, and you do that preparation, you do that research, and you've got those contacts, you can kind of mitigate some of those challenges that could come down further down the track. Yeah?
When you say follow the funding, is there a way that you can do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the benefit of public funding is that it has to be disclosed, right? And so the National Health and Medical Research, the NHMRC, has to kind of disclose what projects it funds. There's also really good information on government websites which are buried because there's just such a volume of it. The best thing that you can do, as boring as it is every May, or the second week of every May, the federal budget comes out, right? Which basically sets out the strategic plan for the government that's in power for the next 12 months. And so they allocate funding depending on their priorities, depending on who's been lobbying, depending on what the challenges facing Australians are. And so when you can have a look at what those funding priorities are, where funding has been delivered to, that's where you get to you see a sense of where the money's at. And then where that's going into the private sector as well. Because the other kind of factor in terms of the relationship between public and private sector is often the private sector will follow where public sector money has been delivered. Because someone said before, government is uniquely placed to look at the long term. Government's probably the only organisation that can bear the risk for a lot of new research, new developments, that sort of thing. Government, to a certain extent, bears a lot of the risk of that and can afford to fail, whereas the private sector is a lot more conservative when it comes to that sort of thing. So when you have a look at the public sector funding priorities for those sorts of things, generally the private sector will follow. And that's only going to increase as there is a greater collaboration between the public and private sectors. So over the last few years, There have been a number of collaboration centres that have been established between different levels of government and private sector organisations around particularly health and education. So that's sort of a quite useful resource to look into, depending on what your what your interests are and what sort of problem you want to solve. And the second thing, so not only follow the funding, but also follow the population. Look at what sort of challenges are facing us on a broader level, and what there's a lot of chatter about at the moment. So, and that you get from having a look at the news media. If anyone saw Four Corners earlier this week, the big issue at the moment is Australia's lack of sustainable waste management in general. So, things that people, the general populace had no idea about. So I don't know if anyone picked up, but not one glass bottle produced in Australia has been recycled in the last 4 years, which is insane, right? I live just down the road from a specific glass recycling plant. They haven't recycled anything. They've just crushed everything, left it in boxes, and continued to import glass from overseas because it's cheaper. Right. Now that there's some sort of chatter about that, governments will be looking at, okay, well, how do we improve that situation? How do we make sure that we're actually kind of recycling and being sustainable, because that is a value of our society. So similar to that, a few weeks ago there was a big expose into water in the Murray-Darling system and how that kind of division of water works. Going into the future, that is going to be a key issue as we go into different weather patterns and that sort of thing, which limit our water supply. So that's why you see the shift in where environmental scientists are working from mining to looking at how do we ensure that our water resources are safe and sustainable, and we're managing them appropriately, and also looking at sort of how you can marry different skills together. So if you have a core area of interest, what other skills can you develop that will make you more valuable in that space? So do you have a keen interest in coding or programming, and how can that help you in your chosen area? Do you have an interest in business development, or do you love talking to people and kind of doing that one-on-one stuff that is super useful in sales, right? So what are the kind of I wouldn't call them soft skills because Sally-Ann was so sort of strident about that, but what are the kind of associated skills that really allow you to ramp up what you can offer and kind of look at your area of expertise or your area of interest in a different way, and how you can kind of take it a bit further, regardless of whether it's public or private sector, again, because things like sales and business development, the public sector uses them just as much as the private sector does. Same deal with coding and programming and intellectual property. Again, very useful in both sorts of sectors. It just depends on how you marry them together, and then how you pitch yourself. It's because no one is going to come along and say, you know what, I've known you for all of 5 minutes, but I reckon this is, this is your professional profile and you are great at this sort of thing, so I'm going to take you on board. Unless you sell yourself, unless you kind of outline what it is that you're interested in, what it is that you do and have to offer to an organisation, and sort of tailoring that pitch according to the particulars of that field, whether it's a private or public sector organisation and their role within that broader field. Unless you sort of do that nuancing, they won't know what it is that you have to offer. So that's the kind of second step to, you've got these core skills, all right, how can we use it? And you've got to make that pitch to a certain extent, which is why it's so tough in the first few years of your postgraduate life to kind of figure out where it is that you fit. Because if I were to ask you right now to go into, say, the Bureau of Meteorology and kind of sell them a pitch as to how you'd fit in that organisation, it's a tough ask. It's a really, really tough ask. It does take a lot of thinking, a lot of time to develop that. And it takes sort of trial and error in terms of your experience. So if you don't really have an idea of what it's like to work there or what the specifics of the industry are, then try and get some knowledge around that so you can add that detail into you. And just to kind of wrap up, because I know we've got a couple of minutes, the sort of traditional employment market or the traditional career pathway is changing for all graduates, as I mentioned. It's not even if you're in a profession. So I mentioned before, I'm a registered occupational therapist. Most people, when I have a chat to them about what it is that they do, sort of go, so you work in a hospital? And I have to go, no, I did at one point, but I don't anymore. This is kind of what I do. And that really blows their mind, because they're used to kind of going, okay, X plus Y equals Z, right? So this person with this particular degree equals this career pathway, or this sort of employment context. That's no longer the case for so many people, particularly for science graduates. So you have the ability, you have the power to sort of determine where it is that you kind of fit along that pathway, and you do that by being proactive in terms of figuring out where you fit, figuring out what sort of problems you want to be involved in, and trying to ferret out opportunities through the different ways that you've heard about today, and meeting people. Just being involved in spaces where things are being talked about is the best way that you can kind of get enough information to make those decisions, because a lot of those decisions you can't really make unless you sort of are involved in those discussions. And I mentioned before that science graduates are the most likely of all STEM professionals to do postgraduate qualifications. There's a link between your employment prospects and postgraduate qualifications, but that's because most people who undertake those postgraduate qualifications, they do so when they've got a bit of an idea as to what they want to do with that, and they then use that to get themselves into that field or that role or that organisation. So someone mentioned before, don't do it for the sake of ticking a box and thinking that it'll make you more employable if you don't really know how you're going to use it or what value it will bring to your skills and to your professional profile. So do a postgrad if you are interested in that area and if you can see how it will translate into opportunities. But if you're just not sure and you want to extend your time at university, probably not the best way to sort of spend a lot of money. So I might wrap up on that note and answer any questions that people might have. Yes?
What really is the difference between private and public sector? Because to me, it hasn't really been clearly defined. Like, I just think public is just government agencies like the ABS.
Yep.
And private is just like any other company like GSK, for example, for pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, sure. So the difference is in their purpose. So that's the single core difference between public and private. It is who they work for, because that then changes, their recruitment processes and what their accountability and that sort of thing. Beyond that, it is very much dependent on the industry, on the discipline, on the field, as to how that interaction works. Does that make sense?
Yeah, kind of. Wait, so what would you say? Would you say like a company like Colgate, for example? Would that be private or public?
That's private. So anything that works that's for profit.
Yep.
So Colgate is a publicly listed company. They have shareholders.
Yep.
So they have shareholders. Their primary goal is to maximise the returns for their shareholders. Funnily enough, just on pharmaceuticals, I was going through our system the other day, and we actually have a whole bunch of members in the TGA, or the Therapeutic Goods Administration. So their role is whenever companies like GSK or Sanofi or Novartis or whoever, which are pharmaceutical companies, whenever they have a new drug that they want to get listed on the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme, it has to go through the TGA, or the Therapeutic Goods Administration. So that has to represent a particular public benefit for the taxpayer to subsidise that particular drug. And there are scientists involved in that all the time. So they may not necessarily be doing the direct testing, but they have a direct impact on the availability of that drug and how much it costs and how accessible it is to everyday Australians, which is kind of cool.